The tension in the air was undeniable. Karen Lawson had made a call she thought was about safety, about protecting the neighborhood from what she convinced herself was an unfamiliar threat. But no, on a quiet suburban afternoon, Karen Lawson sat by her living room window, sipping her usual cup of green tea, her eyes scanning the neighborhood like she did every day. She considered herself a watchful resident, someone who cared about her community's safety. She knew every family, every car, every movement on her street. It gave her a sense of control, of knowing what belonged and what didn't. But when a black man in a sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway of the house 3 doors down, a feeling of unease settled in her chest. That house had been empty for months. She had seen the previous owners move out. There had been no "for sale" sign, no signs of anyone new coming in. Karen watched as the man stepped out of his vehicle, dressed casually in jeans and a navy blue sweater. He moved with quiet confidence, walking to the back of his SUV and grabbing a few boxes. There was nothing frantic or suspicious about his actions. If anything, he looked completely at home. But that was exactly what bothered her. How could he be so comfortable in a house she didn't think belonged to him? Her fingers hovered over her phone. Was he a contractor, a realtor, or was he trespassing? She felt her heart beat faster when he pulled out a key and unlocked the front door. That was it. She dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Karen steadied her voice, trying to sound composed. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious individual. A man just entered a vacant home, and I don't think he's supposed to be there. Can you describe the individual? She hesitated for only a second. Black male, medium build, driving a black SUV. He used a key to go inside. The dispatcher's voice remained neutral. So he used a key? Yes, Karen said quickly, but that house has been empty for months. I don't know if he's supposed to have it. We'll send an officer to check it out. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance. A police cruiser pulled up, blocking the driveway. 2 officers stepped out, hands near their belts, approaching the man who had just come back outside. He looked at them, surprised but calm, raising his hands slightly as they spoke. Karen watched intently, waiting for confirmation that she had been right. But within moments, she saw the officers relax. They weren't arresting him. They weren't even detaining him. One of them pulled out a piece of paper, glanced at it, and nodded. Karen's stomach twisted. Had she made a mistake? She needed to know. Feigning casualness, she stepped outside, pretending to check her mailbox as she moved closer. The officer turned to her. Ma'am, this is Mr. Ellington. He's the new owner. He moved in today. Karen blinked. The man, Marcus Ellington, exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Yeah, I live here. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something controlled, something restrained. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. You assumed I didn't belong, Marcus said, folding his arms. That's not what I... You didn't have to say it, he cut in. The officers exchanged glances. One of them sighed. Ma'am, in the future, we suggest speaking to your neighbors before calling us. Was that a warning? Karen clenched her jaw as the officers walked away. But then Marcus spoke again. Funny thing, he said, his tone shifting. You saw me enter my home, but you never noticed that I saw you first. Karen's pulse quickened. That night, she barely slept, replaying his words over and over again. The next morning, as she peeked through her blinds, Marcus was already there, leaning against his SUV, looking right at her. And then, to her horror, he walked up her driveway. When her doorbell rang, she hesitated before cracking the door open. Marcus held up his phone. Morning. Thought I'd return the favor. Since you've been watching me, I figured I'd stop by and say hi. Karen kept her face neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus smirked. See, I installed security cameras before I moved in. He tapped his phone and turned it around. Footage played. Her, walking past his house, pausing, looking at his driveway, coming back at night. A chill ran down her spine. You called the cops on me, Marcus said, his voice dropping lower. But I've got days of footage of you lurking around my house. Before I even moved in. Karen's throat went dry. I was just taking a walk? Marcus chuckled. Because most people take the same walk past the same house at the same time, every single day? She had no response. Marcus studied her, his smirk fading into something more serious. At first, I wasn't sure what your deal was. But then I did some digging. Turns out this house sat empty for months, yet somehow people around here already knew who was supposed to move in. Karen had lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. She had seen families come and go, watched as new homeowners arrived, exchanged pleasantries at block parties and neighborhood meetings. But Marcus's arrival had been different, not because of anything he had done, but because of what she had assumed before she ever met him. She had been waiting for someone else to move in. Someone who looked like the families who had always lived on this street. Someone familiar. Now she could feel the neighborhood shifting. People had seen what happened. They had watched the police show up at Marcus's house. They had heard the whispers. And then there was the footage. Marcus had proof that she had been watching him before he ever stepped foot inside his home. He had every reason to expose her, to tell the entire neighborhood what she had done. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. Maybe she should talk to him, explain herself, offer some excuse, something that could smooth this over. But what would she even say? That she was just being cautious? That it wasn't about race? That she would have called 911 on anyone? She could hear the weakness in those words before she even spoke them. Minutes passed before she finally stepped outside. Her legs felt heavy as she crossed the driveway and approached Marcus's house. He saw her coming and didn't move. He just watched, waiting. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I wanted to... To what? Marcus interrupted, his voice steady. Explain? Apologize? She swallowed hard. Yes. He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Tell me something, Karen. If I looked different, if I was someone else, someone you expected, would you have called? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Be honest, he pressed, because I already know the answer. Shame burned in her chest. She wanted to defend herself, to say she wasn't like that she wasn't one of those people. But the truth was, she had already answered that question the moment she dialed 911. Marcus nodded, as if he had already prepared himself for her silence. You don't have to say it, he said. You've already shown me exactly who you are. Karen felt small, smaller than she ever had before. The neighborhood had always felt like her place, her safe space, a reflection of the life she had built. But in this moment, she realized something unsettling. She wasn't the one being excluded. She was the one doing the excluding. Marcus didn't need to expose her. The damage had already been done. The real question now was whether she had the courage to face what she had done, and whether she was willing to change. Karen sat in silence that night, the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her like a heavy stone. She had always seen herself as a good person, someone who cared about her community, who wanted to keep her neighborhood safe. But now, sitting alone in the dim glow of her living room lamp, she felt something she hadn't expected. Doubt. It gnawed at her, unraveling the certainty she had once carried so easily. The way Marcus had looked at her earlier, not with anger, but with disappointment, echoed in her mind. That look had been far worse than rage. It was the look of someone who had seen this before, someone who had learned long ago that certain people would always assume the worst of him, no matter who he was or what he had done. She turned off the lamp, but sleep didn't come. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, replaying everything in her mind. The moment she called the police, the way she had justified it to herself, the way she had assumed she was doing the right thing. But if it had been the right thing, why did it feel so wrong now? Why did she feel exposed, as if something inside her had been cracked open and she was finally seeing herself clearly? The next morning she avoided looking out her window, but she knew he was there. Marcus had made it clear that he saw her before she ever saw him. How many times had she watched him, unaware that he had been watching her too? Not with suspicion, not with judgment, but simply because he had noticed. And now she had to ask herself a question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. How many others had she misjudged before him? The day passed slowly, the neighborhood moving on as if nothing had happened. Kids rode their bikes, a couple walked their dog, a delivery truck rumbled down the street. But Karen knew things weren't the same. The illusion of normalcy had been shattered, and in its place was something far more fragile: truth. She had always believed that she was watching over her neighborhood, but now she saw it for what it really was. She hadn't been watching to protect. She had been watching to control. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops, she knew what she had to do. It wasn't enough to sit in guilt, to let the shame settle in her bones and do nothing. She had spent years thinking she was part of what made this neighborhood strong, but strength wasn't about fear or suspicion. Strength was about facing the truth, even when it hurt. She stepped out onto her porch, her heart pounding. Across the street, Marcus was locking his car. He looked up, meeting her gaze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Karen did something she never thought she'd do. She walked toward him. She didn't have the perfect words. She didn't know if an apology would be enough, or if it would even matter. But she knew that staying silent wasn't an option anymore. As she stopped in front of him, Marcus watched her carefully, waiting. "I was wrong," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I made assumptions. I shouldn't have." Marcus didn't respond right away. He just studied her, as if trying to decide if her words were real or just another excuse. Finally, he nodded once. "You did," he said. Karen swallowed. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Marcus exhaled, his expression unreadable. "I don't need to." Karen felt the weight of his words settle over her. He didn't owe her anything. Not forgiveness, not understanding. The only thing that mattered now was what she did next. The world around Karen felt unchanged, yet she knew everything was different. The houses still stood in neat rows. The trees still swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and the familiar sounds of her neighborhood remained the same. But she wasn't the same. The last few days had shaken something loose within her, something she had never questioned before. She had always believed she was a good person, that she was looking out for her community. But now, with each passing moment, she realized that her version of looking out had been built on something much more fragile than she had ever admitted. She watched from her porch as Marcus worked in his yard, his movements unhurried, his expression unreadable. He had been polite when she spoke to him, but his words still echoed in her mind. "I don't need to forgive you." That had unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. She had always thought apologies were supposed to be enough, that simply acknowledging a mistake would make things right. But now she saw that an apology wasn't a solution. It was just the first step. For years, Karen had believed she understood her neighborhood better than anyone. She had prided herself on knowing the people who lived there, the rhythm of their lives, the unspoken rules that made it feel safe. But Marcus had forced her to confront something she had never seen before, her own assumptions. And once she saw them, she couldn't look away. The thought made her stomach tighten. How many times had she looked at someone and assumed she knew their story? How often had she judged someone without speaking to them, without knowing anything about them beyond what she saw? She had convinced herself that her watchful eye kept the neighborhood safe, but in reality, it had only kept certain people comfortable. People like her. That realization burned. It wasn't easy to face the truth about herself. It wasn't easy to admit that she had been wrong. Not just about Marcus, but about the way she had seen the world for so long. She had told herself she wasn't prejudiced, that her call to the police had been about safety, not race. But deep down, she knew the truth. If Marcus had been someone else, someone who looked more like the neighbors she was used to, she wouldn't have called. She wouldn't have questioned whether he belonged. The weight of that truth settled deep in her chest. It wasn't enough to simply feel guilty. Guilt didn't change anything. She had to do more than just acknowledge her mistake. She had to unlearn, to listen, to challenge herself in ways she never had before. That evening, as she sat on her porch, she thought about the future of her neighborhood. Not the way she had always seen it, but the way it truly was. A place that was changing, evolving, whether she liked it or not. And maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe, for the first time, she could be part of that change in a way that actually mattered. She glanced over at Marcus's house. She had been so certain of what she knew before, but now she was ready to learn. Not just about him, but about all the things she had ignored for too long. The truth had been uncomfortable, but maybe that was the point. Maybe real change was supposed to be. Karen sat in silence, the weight of everything that had transpired pressing heavily against her chest. The past few days had unraveled something inside her, forcing her to look at herself in a way she never had before. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who cared about her community, someone who did the right thing. But now, for the first time, she wondered if doing the right thing had always been on her terms. If her definition of right had been shaped by her own narrow understanding of the world. She had watched Marcus move in with suspicion, convinced that his presence was out of place. She had called the police, because it was what she thought a responsible neighbor would do. But standing there, seeing him treated like a potential criminal in his own driveway, something had shifted. It wasn't just the embarrassment of realizing she had been wrong. It was the deeper, more unsettling realization that she had never questioned the biases that led her to that moment. Her fingers traced the edge of her coffee cup as she sat on her porch, staring at the street. Everything looked the same, but she saw it differently now. How many other moments like this had played out in her life, unnoticed, unchallenged? How many times had she assumed the worst about someone without ever considering why? It was easy to tell herself she wasn't prejudiced, that her actions had come from a place of concern rather than bias. But the truth was undeniable now. If Marcus had looked different, if he had fit into the image of what she expected a homeowner in this neighborhood to be, she never would have made that call. That truth settled deep in her bones, uncomfortable, but necessary. She had spent so much time believing she knew this community better than anyone, but now she realized she had only ever seen a version of it that made sense to her. She had built a sense of safety around familiarity, around control, around the quiet assurance that everything remained just as she expected it to be. Marcus hadn't broken any rules. He had simply existed in a space she had unconsciously deemed off-limits to someone like him. And that realization stung in a way she couldn't ignore. Her mind wandered back to their last conversation, to the way he had looked at her, not with anger, but with something even more unsettling. Disappointment. He had expected this from her. He had seen it before. And that was the part that hurt the most. She wasn't an exception. She was just another person who had judged before understanding, who had acted out of fear rather than reason. Change wasn't easy. She knew that now. It wasn't about saying the right things or offering apologies that made her feel better. It was about undoing the quiet, automatic judgments that had shaped her thinking for so long. It was about listening more than she spoke, questioning more than she assumed, and recognizing that her version of the world was not the only one that existed. As she sat there, watching the neighborhood settle into the evening, she made a decision. She wasn't going to pretend the past few days hadn't happened. She wasn't going to brush aside what she had learned. She was going to start with something simple, getting to know the people she had so easily labeled as outsiders. She didn't expect forgiveness, nor did she deserve it. But what she could do was move forward differently, more aware, more willing to see beyond her own perspective. For the first time, Karen truly saw her neighborhood, not just the parts she had been comfortable with, but all of it. And that, she realized, was the beginning of something new. Karen's story is not just about one mistaken phone call. It is about something much deeper, something that exists in neighborhoods across America, often unnoticed, often unspoken. It is about the quiet, underlying biases that shape how we see the world, how we judge others, and how we decide who belongs and who doesn't. It is about the split-second decisions we make, the ones we don't question, because they feel natural, until we are forced to confront the truth behind them. At its core, this story is a reflection of how deeply ingrained prejudices can be, even in those who do not see themselves as prejudiced. Karen did not wake up that morning thinking she was going to discriminate against someone. She believed she was protecting her community. She believed she was acting out of concern, not malice. And that is the danger, how easily suspicion can masquerade as vigilance, how quickly assumptions can turn into actions with real consequences. This story reminds us that intent does not erase impact. Karen did not intend to harm Marcus, but her call to the police could have changed the course of his life. In a different scenario, without the right documentation, without the right officers responding, without a calm and measured reaction, Marcus could have been arrested, or worse. We have seen how these situations can escalate. We have seen lives lost because of a false assumption, a hasty call, a moment of fear disguised as responsibility. Marcus's reaction is just as important as Karen's mistake. He did not respond with rage, nor did he let the situation slide. He confronted it directly, forcing Karen to see herself through his eyes, forcing her to recognize that her actions were not isolated, but part of a larger pattern. His decision to turn the tables, to show her that she had been watching him long before she ever realized it, was a powerful moment. It exposed the contradiction in her own thinking. She had seen herself as the protector, yet she had been the one acting with unwarranted suspicion. She had seen Marcus as the outsider, yet it was her actions that disrupted his right to simply exist in his own home. The lesson here is not just about race. It is about awareness. It is about questioning the things we take for granted, the judgments we make without thinking. It is about recognizing that safety and comfort should not come at the cost of someone else's dignity. We all have biases, whether we acknowledge them or not. The challenge is not to pretend they don't exist, but to confront them, to challenge them, and to grow beyond them. This story also speaks to the power of accountability. Karen had a choice. She could have doubled down, made excuses, dismissed Marcus's words as overreaction. But instead, she listened. She allowed herself to feel the discomfort of realizing she was wrong, and she made the decision to do better. That is the difference between ignorance and growth. Growth is uncomfortable. It forces us to look at ourselves in ways we may not want to, but it is necessary if we are to build a world that is truly fair, truly just, truly equal. For everyone who has ever been judged unfairly, who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong, who has ever had to prove their worth just to exist peacefully, this story is for you. And for those who have never had to question how they are perceived, who have never had to wonder if they will be mistaken for a criminal in their own driveway, this story is for you too. Because change does not come from those who are already suffering. It comes from those who choose to open their eyes, to speak up, to make different choices. The fight for civil rights is not just about laws and policies. It is about everyday moments like these. It is about the small decisions that shape the world we live in. It is about choosing to be better, even when no one is watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you question or reflect, then join us. Subscribe to Civil Rights Fight and be part of the conversation. Be part of the movement. Be part of the change. Because the fight for justice is not over, and every voice matters. Together we can build a future where no one has to justify their existence, where dignity, respect, and equality are not just ideals, but reality.